По 2 децении европски пат, Македонија е на чекор од она што ќе значи вистински пристапни преговори за членство. Но чекорот која дели од тоа обврската за уставни измени запишана во преговарачката рамка ја вовлече земјата во подлабока општествена поделба и политичка криза, од кој засега не се надзира излез. Европската унија во меѓувреме го одбројува времето до ноември, неформалниот рок до кога треба да се завршат уставните измени за Македонија да премине во втората фаза од отворањето на пристапните преговори, втората меѓувладина конференција и отворањето на првиот кластер. Но дали уставните измени се бреме само за Македонија? Го знае ли Унијата начинот како да се стигне до нив, но и што и следи на земјава на евроинтегративниот пат без нив? Во меѓувреме, реформите се под лупа на Европската комисија, која во октомври ќе каже дали земјава го подобрила или не минатогодишниот скор со јакнење на демократијата и владењето на правото и покрај сите предизвици со кои се сочила. Добро вечер, со топ темата почнуваме веднаш по рекламите. Вечерашен гостин во топ тема е амбасадорот на Европската унија во Македонија, господинот Дејвид Гир. Good evening.
Добар вечер.
Welcome.
Thank you.
Амбасадоре Гир, веднаш ќе преминам на она што македонската јавност е сведок подолго време, поточно дека опаѓа поддршката за Европската унија во земјава и таа е на најниско ниво досега. Што според вас лично, еве ако може да процените, е причина за тоа?
I think the polls that we're seeing at the moment show support for the European Union in the mid-60s or the higher 60s. But you're right, that's a drop from where we were some years ago. I think our sense when we talk to people and meet people is that in general people understand the benefits that would come from EU membership in terms of prosperity, stability and security and the future of this country in the European Union. But there are questions about, well, when and will this really happen? And that, of course, has, I think, resulted in some cases in a loss of confidence and the lower ratings. But the general direction and the general desire is clear. So we can't be complacent about that. I think the reasons are multiple, but of course the delays in the opening of accession negotiations over time, it's taken a long time, too long, must be part of that reason.
Тоа ме води кон второто прашање, дали може би вината за тоа лоцирате и во самата Европска унија, бидејќи речиси 20 години земјава е кандидат со кандидатски статус, од кои 13 години не можеше да ја реализира препораката на Европската комисија за старт на преговорите. Тоа се случи минатата година, но и тоа делумно, бидејќи за да се премине во втората фаза треба да се исполнат уставните измени. Може ли со мирна совест Европската унија да каже не е до нас?
I think there are responsibilities on both sides. Sure, I think there are responsibilities on the European Union side. It has taken a long time, as I say, too long, and that has impacted on confidence. But there's also responsibility on the side of successive governments and authorities, because the heart of the accession process is about implementing reforms which would make it possible for this country to join the European Union on a level, on an equal footing to member states. And responsibility for implementing those reforms has been with successive governments. And so one has to ask the question, why have we not advanced more? Yes, the country has made progress, and we've reported on that in many areas, but still much more could have been expected. We should not be today having to have very extensive and difficult discussions about the rule of law, the fight against corruption, all of these key issues, which are still big issues some 30 years since the state was established. So there is responsibility there too on the authorities' side to advance, because ultimately that's the key to joining the European Union.
Минатата година преговорите конечно започнаа со одржување на првата меѓувладина конференција меѓу Европската унија и Македонија. Но наместо тоа да ја смири на електризираната политичка состојба во земјата и поделбата во општеството, тоа уште повеќе ја разгоре. Поточно, обврската од преговарачката рамка за уставни измени го продлабочи јазот во онака поделеното општество. Дали со тоа, со ставањето на уставните измени, впишувањето на уставните измени во преговарачката рамка, Европската унија посредно влијаше на продлабочување на кризата, политичката криза во Македонија?
I think what happened last year was, if you like, a breakthrough. There had been this veto for some 18 months, and a compromise was found as a way to go forward, in a compromise which, in my view, while it doesn't please everyone, because no compromise ever does, nonetheless was an opportunity for this country to move forward decisively. You took that opportunity, you started the process of screening, you began the negotiations. So I think that was a very positive development. Of course, I understand that at the time of the debate last July, there were many emotions. There was a lot of confusion, even bewilderment. What does this mean for us? Does it affect our identity? Questions like that. Perhaps we could have communicated more clearly about what the deal is itself. But I think when one looks at the questions that were asked there, some in a heartfelt manner which was genuine and truly pained from individual citizens, some in a more cynical way, I think, and somewhat manipulated. Let's look at those questions. First big question that came was, will our language be lost? Are we giving away our language? Not at all. The opposite is the case. The negotiating framework has the language, Macedonian language, with no qualification in it. This is the basis on which negotiations will be advanced. And since then, you've seen agreements such as the Frontex agreement and other being endorsed in the Macedonian language within the context of the European Union. The second issue, issues of will history, will identity, will these issues be put into doubt as a result of this agreement? Again, the answer to that is you just don't lose your identity on the way to the European Union. Look at any other country that has joined, and they often had anxieties about this question, especially smaller countries. What has proven to be the case, exactly the opposite. So it was a very heady and difficult debate. What it really points to, though, is a much deeper issue here, and that is the general question of polarization in the country itself, political polarization, because the EU accession process requires the political parties from across the political divide to come together on an EU agenda of reform. They almost all, are politically committed to joining the European Union, but that needs to translate into agreement across the divide to work together to achieve that goal.
Реален ли е стравот кој го имаат поголемиот дел од македонските граѓани дека уставните измени нема да бидат последното такво барање до Македонија, билатерално барање до Македонија?
Well, the constitutional change will not be the last demand made of this country. We will be asking this country every step of the way to make reforms. The important thing is that...
But bilateral issue?
Not on the bilateral. This is my point. The important thing is that the demands should be made on the basis of reforms. Will you put into place the reforms for the rule of law, in the environment, in all of these areas? That's where the focus should be. There should not be bilateral demands coming into the process.
Оптимист е дека во вакви услови на поделеност, како што ги констатиравме, и евроскептицизам кој е зголемен, може до ноември да се донесат уставните измени, од кои зависи вториот чекор за Македонија, за продолжување на преговорите.
I think again, the question of how to advance now is a bigger one, a question of can the country come together on a program of EU reforms, cutting across the political divide in order to advance decisively. When you look at other countries, take Croatia or Slovenia, any of those countries which have joined quite recently, their experience was of the political groups coming together while being, quite divided on many areas, but in this area working together in order to achieve a common goal of joining the European Union. And I think the same would need to apply here for the constitutional changes, But that's only in the beginning, because after that, at every step of the way, there needs to be that joint determination to move forward.
But you're optimist that constitutional changes will happen till November?
That will be the responsibility of the individual, for the constitutional changes, it will be the responsibility of the individual members of Parliament. What I would say to them, and that's something that they will have to decide for themselves, is to look at the big picture, look at what the national interest is, and decide on that basis. And I think that if people look at that big question, then I have some optimism that we can move forward.
Кој би бил начинот за тоа да се случи до ноември, со оглед дека и власта, опозицијата по тоа прашање во моментов се на спротивставени страни, поточно на диаметрално спротивни страни по ова прашање?
I think the only way to move forward on this is through dialogue between the parties and across the country as well, to see what the national interest is and how to move forward. We live in a remarkable time at the moment. It's very difficult. But one of the consequences of Russia's war on Ukraine has been that we see a new dynamism, if you like, in the enlargement process, a seriousness and a determination to move forward, a momentum. And momentum in politics and in international affairs is not something you miss. So this is, I believe, an opportunity for the country to move forward on this enlargement wave decisively. When one looks at I think the other element which will be important also in this debate is to look not at talking these general terms, but also to look precisely what is on the table in terms of the constitutional amendments. And as far as we understand, this will be to include people who self-identify as Bulgarian and some other groups within the constitution. This country has a good record of inter-ethnic relations, and one can argue that this is merely making explicit what is already implicit in the constitution. But that's, of course, a sovereign decision, a decision for the parliamentarians to take, but I would just urge them dialogue, openness, and consider what they think is in the best national interest.
Во контекст на барањата и понудите кои стигнаа меѓу опозицијата и власта за да се дојде до уставните измени, Европската унија децидно кажа дека менувањето на преговарачката рамка е нешто што не е опција, како ни стапување на сила на уставните измени по втората меѓувладина конференција, нешто пак што беше дел од барањата на опозицијата. Гледате ли маневрски простор за вин-вин излез и за опозицијата и за власта од моменталната ситуација, а уставните измени да бидат донесени?
The agreement that was reached last year in July, I think again was an opportunity. That agreement stands. I don't think the EU wants to revisit this agreement, and I don't frankly see Bulgaria wanting to re-engage on revising the bilateral agreement that was reached separately from this. So again, the key, I think, is for the parties to talk together and to see if they can find this win-win solution, which is basically reaching an agreement to move forward on the European path, which is overwhelmingly in the interests of citizens from an economic point of view, from the future of jobs, from the future of reversing that spiral of people leaving the country. So I think there is the win-win of the parties coming together and trying to find a solution. The leaders' meetings that took place, that's a good start, but we would encourage to continue in that vein, because it's going to become absolutely necessary throughout the process, not just for the constitutional changes, as I say, but for the future in each difficult step of reform.
Во играта на пазарењето или во процесот на пазарење меѓу власта и опозицијата, во игра беа и предвремени избори за кои опозицијата бара да бидат ова есен. Дали овој процес на избори, значи прогласување, формирање на нова влада би имало можност да одложи втората меѓувладина конференција и доколку уставните измени бидат донесени во ноември?
If I understand your question rightly, the position is this, that if the constitutional changes are made,
yes,
then the next step automatically is the holding of an intergovernmental conference. For your viewers, an intergovernmental conference is the way in which the EU reviews each step of the accession process.
But if country have elections in meantime, that will
I don't know, because I mean that's a matter for the EU and for North Macedonia to decide. But if the changes are made, it's automatically that it goes to the next stage. There's no further decision needed from the EU, and there's no possibility at that stage of any further veto. So it's an automatic process. And that would be whether or not to actually hold the intergovernmental conference, I think, would be for the EU and for North Macedonia to decide. I don't see any problem in principle in moving forward.
So in that case, there just will be technical issue when the date will be set?
In my view, that's what it's about, because it's the decision to have a second governmental conference intergovernmental conference has already been made, provided the constitutional changes are adopted.
Што доколку не се донесат уставните измени, какви би биле последиците за евроинтегративниот пат на земјата? Многу се зборува за тоа, но што конкретно ќе значи тоа за Македонија?
In practice, if the constitutional changes are not made, and it's a sovereign decision, at that stage, the process that we've seen of screening and of moving forward and going to the next step of the intergovernmental conference, that would stop. You are what we call a negotiating partner, together with Serbia, together with Montenegro, Albania. For you, that process would stop. For the others, we would see it would depend on their own progress in reforms. That doesn't mean that the EU would disappear. We will continue to be here. We will continue to support the country, to continue to invest. It doesn't mean that you shouldn't continue with reforms, because that is still the fastest way to the European Union. But I think the path is much more difficult, and it comes back to that point I was making about momentum. The fear that we have is that this momentum might be lost, and this opportunity to move forward decisively could be lost.
Во неколку наврати власта предупредува дека доколку не се донесат уставните измени и запрент евроинтегративниот пат на ваков начин, како што го објаснивте, дека ќе се радикализираат работите во сите области во земјата. Кој е вашиот коментар на тоа?
I think it's very important, and this is a responsibility for politicians, to try and take the heat out of some of these issues. Discussions often take place in a very polarized manner with sort of high octane debate, and that is not helpful. And I think if the constitutional changes don't go through, it will be important for everyone to try and come together and see how to move forward, rather than polarizing the issues even further, possibly in view of an election, and then it becomes very toxic and very difficult to come out of that place. So again, what is needed is an ability to reach across the political divide and to have dialogue across opposition and government, because you're going to need that. That's going to be the DNA between now and the time that you join the European Union, and I do believe that you will join the European Union.
Господин амбасадоре, дали ставањето на уставните измени во преговарачката рамка ја отвори пандорината кутија за самата Европска Унија како услов во иднина сите земји кандидати кои ќе бараат членство, кои ќе се борат за членство во Унијата, да имаат билатерални услови?
Now, it's a good question, and people often ask this question because there are obviously fears behind it. But you have to draw a distinction in the accession process. We have something called good neighbourly relations. And the responsibility for a country which is wanting to join the European Union to have good neighbourly relations exists in all negotiating frameworks. What does that mean? That means non-discrimination against minorities within the country who may belong to another people, and in general conducting good relations with your neighbours. More specifically, it talks about achieving tangible results and ensuring that the treaties such as the Prespa Treaty or the Treaty on Friendship with Bulgaria are implemented in good faith. That's something different and something separate from these other bilateral issues which touch on questions of history, interpretations of culture or identity, which should not be part of that process.
Му наштети ли, ова е прашање кое е наповрзано со претходното, му наштети ли на самата Европска Унија на кредибилитетот на проширувањето и на процесот на проширувањето со вметнување на билатерално прашање во преговарачка рамка, бидејќи самиот процес е исполнување на копенхашките критериуми, а не на билатерални прашања?
Actually, I think this question takes us to the heart of what the accession process is about, because it's about reform. And you hear us banging on about reform, but why do we do it? for two reasons. What we can't have is a country joining the European Union which is not prepared to be a member. In other words, it brings in instability into the Union, or it, one way or another, undermines the single market of the European Union, etc. And from your interest, North Macedonia would not be in a good position if it was to enter such a very competitive environment as the European Union, including its single market of 450 million people, if it was really not prepared, didn't have the institutions in place, didn't have the means to take all the benefits from membership. So that's why reform is absolutely central. And reform is comprehensive, covering virtually all areas of activity, from agriculture to trade, customs to taxation, corruption, fighting corruption to the rule of law. So that's why we focus so much on reform. And that's the way to get towards the European Union. There's no shortcut on that. The faster you go on reforms, the quicker you will join the European Union. Our experience on some of these bilateral questions with other accession processes is often at the beginning they seem huge and very daunting and difficult to manage, but as the focus moves onto the reform agenda, these start to die away and the real issues, which is the difficult process of reform, advances.
Македонија по отварањето на одржувањето на првата меѓувладина конференција започна со скрининг процесот. Тој се уште е во тек, ако не се лажам, вчера беа отворени 2 нови поглавја по кои се преговара, се прави скрининг во Брисел. Дали процесот се одвива според предвиденото темпо?
Yeah, just maybe a word on screening first of all, because in the accession process we use all these terms and it's quite confusing for people. So what we want to do in the accession process is make sure that when you join, your laws and practices are in line with other EU member states. That means changing the legislation, but that's not enough. You know very well there's lots of legislation on the statute books which is not actually put into practice. So we need to make sure it's implemented and enforced, which means that you have the institutions and the ways to ensure that laws are obeyed. So what we do, we start out by looking at these many different areas and sitting down with you, with your experts in Brussels and our experts from the European Commission, and look at where are you and what do you need to do in order to get to that position of being able to join the European Union. The process was launched last September. It's going very well. Your teams are well organized, they are prepared, they're asking the right questions, and I think it's progressing well. So the screening is a success story. It's not yet finished, it will carry on, but it's a success story, and I think it's showing what the country can do when it really focuses on the job at hand.
Кога може да ги очекуваме првите извештаи од завршениот од првиот кластер кој е веќе завршен? Кога може да се очекува? Македонската влада го најавува уште од април дека ќе стигне веќе јули, со оглед дека од нив зависи финиширањето на 3 патокази кои треба да бидат готови до отворање на втората фаза, поточно отворањето на кластери. Тоа се патоказите за реформа на јавната администрација, патоказот за владење на правото и патоказот за функционални институции.
Okay, so now we're back in the screening process
Yes.
again. So here we are, the screening's going on in Brussels. Everyone's meeting in dark rooms and, not enjoying the sunshine outside, but they're actually focusing on the job at hand. That's great. As that process is completed, the European Commission prepares what it calls a screening report, which reflects the detailed discussions that have taken place between the parties and is basically a snapshot of where the country is in the different areas, and there are many different areas. One lesson we've learned from the past is that there's a group of areas, group of issues, which are so important that we describe them as fundamentals. So that's the rule of law, the fight against corruption, public administration reform, and how you manage public management of money. So that's called the fundamentals. And the next step after this screening report would be to open the cluster, we call them clusters, this cluster of the fundamentals, the issues I've just mentioned, and so that we can see, so that you can begin the negotiations in detail in that area. That cluster is so important that it will begin on day 1 and will be reviewed throughout and will only be closed just before you join the European Union itself. In order to make it simpler, it doesn't sound simpler, but in order to make it simpler, we have this idea of roadmaps. So your country basically drafts the roadmaps on public administration reform and the rule of law, saying what it's going to do and how it's going to do. And the 27 member states sitting in Brussels compare that roadmap with the screening report and the benchmarks which they think you need to meet to open discussions. And then, hey presto, we have a intergovernmental conference and you then move forward. It sounds quite bureaucratic and complex, but in fact the idea is all the time to be putting down practical measures of what you need to do and monitoring and following up to make sure that it really is being implemented and it's not just on paper.
Do you have information when those reports will be delivered to the country?
I don't know yet when it will be delivered. I think the first thing, because it's quite complex, there's a lot of areas, the first thing will be to complete that and then discuss it among the member states, the 27 member states in Brussels, and then it would be delivered to the country.
Освен овие три патокази, Македонија треба да подготви и акцијски план за почитување на правата на малцинствата, кој треба да биде усвоен едногласно од сите 27 земји членки за да се отвори првиот кластер од преговорите. Постои ли можност неговото усвојување да биде условено со некое ново билатерално прашање?
We've agreed on the negotiating framework, so we know what needs to be done. And in this area, this action plan on minorities, it goes back to what I said about good neighbourly relations. It's not about bilateral issues in the sense of identity and language and history. It's about respect for minorities. So what we would expect is that this action plan would be developed by this country in an inclusive manner, looking at how minorities are treated, we use the word minorities, non-majority communities, are treated here in terms of non-discrimination, hate speech, education, all of those kind of questions. Then that issue would become part of the discussions on good neighbourly relations, quite separate, I think, from the other issues I mentioned.
Но дали постои можност, например, на инсистирање на Бугарија, обврските за Македонија кои се земени со протоколот со Бугарија да станат дел од овој документ, значи од акцијскиот план за правата на малцинствата и со тоа да станат обврска кон Европската унија за да се добие едногласност од Европскиот совет? Дали постои таква можност?
No, because I think, as I said, this action plan is about minorities in general. Obviously, that will include people who self-identify as Bulgarian, and we'll look at the way they're treated here, but it will deal with other minorities as well. And it's not about bringing in new conditions, it's about respecting that basic principle which applies in all negotiations with all of the all accession negotiations with negotiating partners, to respect good neighbourly relations.
Амбасадоре Гир, сега ќе преминеме на темите, реформите, извештајот кој се подготвува. Вие на почетокот и споменавте дел од тоа, од реформскиот процес, но сега ќе навлеземе малку по-конкретно. Се подготвува новиот извештај на Европската комисија за напредокот на земјава. Што може да очекуваме во него? Во кои делови Македонија направила напредок, а во кои не, во изминатава година?
I'm sure you can imagine that I can't comment on the report yet, not least because it's still being drafted and we expect it to come out sometime in the autumn, as is usual. Just for your viewers, this is an annual country report which assesses progress the country made in reforms across the board. But what I can say is that while we've seen progress in many areas over the years, we are concerned at the moment, especially in some of these key fundamental areas we're talking about, the developments in the rule of law, the fight against corruption, the difficulties with public administration. All of these remain really serious challenges. And we've seen some developments, for example, in the rule of law in the recent months, which is certainly not the direction you would expect from a negotiating partner. So I think you can expect in all of our remarks now that we will continue to be critical when there are problems, but also we will praise when progress is made. At the moment, it's not a great look in terms of the especially in the rule of law and the fight against corruption. We need to see decisive action in these areas.
Една од темите на кои Европската унија беше многу гласна беше користењето на европското знаменце. Дали во овој извештај користењето на европското знаменце ќе биде означено со уназадено?
On the, you're talking about the European flagging question. I mean, on this issue, your viewers might be scratching their heads and saying, what is this European flag issue about? It's actually quite a simple idea. In order for you to join the European Union, you have to adopt thousands and thousands of pages of laws. If you were to just put those laws through the normal parliamentary procedure, you would be joining, I don't know, in 50 years' time. So what we do is we have this idea of a European flag, where when you are making changes to the law to bring that law into line with EU legislation, you can put the EU flag on it, and that speeds the process up. And it's a really useful way of moving forward quickly. But that should not be a way of avoiding public consultation, and it should not be a way of dealing with problems that you have in parliamentary procedure. But we've been saying for many years that the use of this the EU flag in this way has been misused, and it should not be. It should only be used for when it's about making sure your legislation comes into line with EU legislation.
But it will be a critical wording in the report, especially for the flag connected with the Actal Bank agreement.
Well, you'll have to wait and see the report, but you've heard me before on the issue of the Bechtel-Enka agreements, which I criticized the use of the EU flag for exactly the reason I just given.
Што може да се очекува во делот на судството со оглед дека сите случувања во изминатиот период што се случува во судскиот совет? Таму имаше многу турбуленции. Што може во тој дел да се очекува?
Yeah, I think turbulence is certainly the word for it. We followed closely with great concern. The Judicial Council has a very special role to play. It's supposed to protect and promote the independence, professionalism and integrity of the judiciary. That's its job. And it's clearly not doing that. And what we've seen recently is a real, the recent developments have been very concerning indeed. So much so that we've now proposed to the government that we will deploy here a high-level peer review mission of the Judicial Council to look at ways in which we can address this issue of professionalism, integrity and independence so that it can really do its job in the future. Of course, it's an advisory group, a peer review. We hope to do it shortly, but I think it indicates how much attention we give to the rule of law and how important we consider the role of the Judicial Council. This needs fixing.
Министерот за надворешни работи Бујар Османи викендов изјави дека губи надеж дека државата сама може да го поправи, да ги поправи состојбите во судството, туку тоа може да се случи само доколку земјата ги започне преговорите и ги отвори поглавјата 23 и 24. Како го толкувате ова со оглед дека доаѓа од земја кандидат за членство и тоа на чекор од отварање на првиот кластер?
I think he's pointing to an important point, which is that the power of the accession process is to help overcome resistance to reform. Any administration, any country, always when you're carrying out reforms, you run into institutional inertia, vested interests when people don't want to reform because they're quite comfortable and benefiting from the current situation, or sometimes fear of changes. And so it's quite difficult to advance on reforms. But the good thing about the accession process is because it sets out in this very systematic way exactly what needs doing, those who want to push reform get a boost from the EU, from the accession process, because it's making it very clear this has to be done. If you don't do it, you won't move forward. And so that tends to help to overcome this inertia or vested interest. And that's, again, I think, why the accession process can be so helpful on reform. Of course, we don't just sit back and say, do the reforms. We invest enormously with our financial, economic and expert assistance to help the country move forward, but it's really in your hands and depends on political will and determination.
Неретко дипломати од земји членки на Европската Унија се гласни ги коментираат случувањата, особено во судството. Некои дури побара и конкретни мерки, дури промена на некои суди. Помагаат или одмагаат ваквите интервенции на стратските дипломати во одредени критични сфери од реформите, од областите во земјата, особено како што е судството, например?
The international community can help on reforms. We can provide political support sometimes. And that can sometimes mean calling out when there are obvious problems. We can provide what I've described as financial economic expert assistance. But at the end of the day, the momentum, the dynamism for this has to come from within the country. And there's a limit to what the international community can or should do. The reform needs to be pushed forward from the country by the leadership, across the political divide, and by everyone. So, there is a limit to how much we can and should do, even though I think as friends of this country, we certainly want to do the maximum possible.
How you comment the fight against organized crime and corruptions, according to what's happened last few days with this new case, Phoenix, etc., and Merco?
I'm sure you'll understand that I can't comment on individual cases, not least because they're part of the investigation by the prosecutor and by the courts. But on fighting corruption, this is a fundamental issue which we follow from the very beginning. We are really concerned. Yes, there are some positive areas here. Look at the work of the State Commission for the Prevention of Corruption. It's done some valuable work. The State Audit Office has also produced very valuable reports on what needs to be done. One has to ask why the recommendations from both bodies are not adequately followed up. I think from the State Commission last year, only 10% of its recommendations were followed. So what is needed is decisive action once more to follow up on the fight against corruption. And that's not just from government, but it starts with government, of course. It has the recommendations, it should act on them, but it also means the courts need to be serious about it and not become themselves captured by different financial or political issues. And it means that civil society, media and others need to continue to press for a change. People often talk to me and they almost despairing, thinking that change is impossible. I can promise you that change is very possible. You need to make small steps, but you need to make consistent steps. And I've seen that in some of the countries that I've lived in the course of my life, where I've seen changes, not only institutional, but changes in attitude, which meant that corruption could be very seriously reduced.
Како котира земјата во делот на почитувањето на човековите права?
I think the country has been transformed since the time of Nicola Gruevski, with a much improved record. There's less fear. There is without fear. We see strengthening of rights in many different areas, and this is very positive and has been reported widely by the international community and other commentators. This is really good. Of course, it doesn't mean that it's perfect, far from it. There are some very difficult areas. Take the prison and penitentiary system. It's a very difficult situation. It needs real action to address the conditions in prisons. You can take other areas where there are pressures, for example, even in the area of freedom of the media and expression. You know very well some of the pressures that come and some of the obstacles to ensuring the best quality and the freest media possible. And there are pressures in other areas as well. So there is always more to be done in the area of human rights. We should not get complacent, because we know very well that nothing is given, but we have to keep coming back and keep moving forward. This will again be part of the accession process. It is a positive in general, but of course there are many areas where more is needed.
Минатата недела се одржа протест организиран од Македонската православна црква Охридска архиепископија против новиот предлог закон за родова еднаквост. Според вас, дали правата на маргинализираните групи се доволни почитувани во земјава и дали нивното унапредување може да ги загрози традиционални семејни вредности од што се плашат одредени кругови во Македонија?
Let's come back to the notion of what human rights are about. It's actually a kind of minimalist approach. It's about protecting those characteristics of a human being which are essential for his or her own identity and humanity, so that they can live a life which is free of fear, that they can express themselves as they wish, that they can express their belief, they can express their political opinions, they can form relations with others, they can take part in society. It's about respect and dignity. That is what human rights very much are about protecting. Of course, in our modern world, it's an evolving concept as well. And sometimes there is discussions about how far human rights go and how does that intersect with other concerns. Take, for example, the notion of traditional family values, whatever that may mean. And it means different things for different people. But there is a vivid debate on that issue. But I think when those discussions take place, it's very important that they take place in a very open manner, each side listening to the other in a manner of dialogue in order to understand. And it's particularly important if you have a marginalized group which is less able to defend itself or speak out, that we should take particular care not to turn them in one way or another into a kind of scapegoat, that they're the bad ones. Because bad ones of this type today can become, let's say, migrants tomorrow, or could be a non-majority community the day afterwards, or who knows, some of your viewers may move to the European Union and be living in the European Union and find themselves to be a minority in those countries and may experience it themselves. The church, the mosque and synagogue, they're of course, a huge comfort to millions of people, and therefore they have an important voice. But we live in a secular society, all of our societies in the European Union and in here, and it's important that governments and local authorities represent all of that society, people of faith but also people who are not of faith, and that when there are discussions like this, that they're pursued in a way which I think helps to ensure better mutual understanding and thereby reinforcing the rights of all.
Амбасадоре Гир, ви благодарам на интервјуто и што бевте гостин во вечерашната Топ Тема. Thank you for being guest in Топ Тема. А на вам, драги гледачи, ви посакувам убава вечер и останете со програмата на Телма.